Hello, everyone. Looks like we have a nice group today. Thank you so much for joining and welcome. On behalf of all of us at GBMP, thanks for joining us today. I'm Melinda Minente. I'm Continuous Improvement Manager at GBMP, and I'm joined by my colleagues today, Dan Fleming, President of GBMP, and Scott Gavin, co-founder of the Respect for People Roadmap. So glad you're with us. We're glad to have you with us for this second session in our five-part series on building the conditions for continuous improvement. If you remember, in our first session, we looked at when and how improvement happens and how interpersonal competencies and conditions shape culture and performance. And today we're going to begin exploring the design of the roadmap itself, starting with this first principle, which is engage with compassion, and why we see it as the foundation for better problem solving. If you were not able to attend the last session, we think it's worth going back to watch as it sets the foundation for the series and the design logic for the roadmap. That's going to be helpful context as we move through the program. And so in a moment here, I'll put that link to the recording into chat. So if you haven't had a chance, you can access that easily.
Hi, everyone. This is Dan. As a reminder, our goal with this series was to give leaders invested in building a culture of continuous improvement an opportunity to learn more about what it really takes, what it looks like in practice, and how achievable it can be when approached systematically. The Respect for People roadmap is a learning experience that we think helps organizations build these conditions remarkably well. And that is not only due to the subject of the learning, but the design of the learning itself. Our goal in developing this program was to help organizations move from improvement efforts that depend heavily on leaders and change agents, as you can see on the left. I'm sure you're very familiar with that, to creating collective capability that compounds. The roadmap maps the distance between those two states, the left and the right. We all want to be on the right, but we're often stuck in the left. The distance between those two states is, as just stated in this section here, is the interpersonal competencies that people need to develop and the organizational conditions those competencies help create. Interpersonal competencies and organizational conditions are the focus of the learning because both have a significant influence on what happens at the point of execution. On the left-hand side is that technical knowledge. We're used to the technical science or the tools of continuous improvement. On the right-hand side is more relational. And the relational is social is more than just simply social awareness. It's what we're calling interpersonal competencies in organizational conditions. These all come together at that point of execution. This is where that technical knowledge that we currently might have meets the reality of the environment people are working in, and what people know either translates into action or it doesn't translate into actions. So what happens when there's action, when there's not necessarily action that you expect? So as discussed last time, improvement doesn't just happen because people understand what they're supposed to do. What someone knows technically is only part of what influences the action, the behaviors they take. At the point of execution, people are gauging constantly what they feel, what they think, what they know about the environment as they decide what to do. They are evaluating what is safe, what is acceptable, what is likely to be supported or rewarded, and what carries social or professional risk. So these happen instinctively, intuitively. Sometimes they're comfortable, sometimes they're not. And then they act, assuming they are. I'm going to hand it over now to Scott, who will remind us of what this looks like.
Right. Thanks, Dan. So I think last time we talked about the andon cord, and the andon cord is really a good example of this. We tend to think of it as like a technical mechanism. Someone knows when to pull it. They know how to pull it, and there's a process for what happens when they do pull it. But that's only part of what determines whether they actually use it or not. The other part is what they expect is going to happen when they do. Will the problem be taken seriously? Will they be supported? Are they going to get blamed? Are they, going to create a problem for someone else. Actually, Dan and I were recounting a story right before we started here. When I was younger, I was a meter reader, and I remember I finished my book by lunch, and I went in and to the office, handed it in. They gave me another one, and then later that afternoon, three of the older meter readers were like, "Dude, what are you doing? You're not supposed to do that." And so we're making decisions based on our experience in that environment. I can tell you, I never turned in a book early after that day. And so people, how they are seen by their colleagues, how they respond, all of these things are affected by kind of the environment that is around them. So the person may know exactly what the standard is to do, to pull the andon cord, turn in the book. The real question is whether the environment gives them the confidence to act on what they know or what they're expected, or what they think the expectation is. And this is where interpersonal competencies and organizational conditions begin to connect very directly. The worker is responding to the environment, but the environment is also being created through the choices and the responses of the people that are in that environment. So, which kind of brings me back to a systems idea that most of us probably know pretty well. That, from Edward Deming, every system is perfectly designed to get the results that it gets. So we usually apply that thinking to a process, a value stream, or the way work is designed. But over time, I started to see that the same thing is true about kind of these interpersonal systems, or this interpersonal dynamics that we have around the work as well. The environment that makes someone willing or maybe unwilling to pull that andon cord is being shaped every day by how people respond to problems, or to questions, to mistakes, maybe to those disagreements that we have, but basically to each other. And once you start looking at it that way, you realize that those interactions are not just happening inside the system, they're actually part of the system, sometimes for better or worse. But the way people respond to one another helps shape what people believe is safe, what is maybe acceptable to do, with it, what is maybe worth doing next. And that has a direct impact on how the work gets done, or in some cases, doesn't get done. I don't go get that second book. So what I want to do here is I'm going to show you all a picture. And so I want you to get your chat ready. So in your chat, you're going to drop in the first word that you come up with. And I don't want you to think about it too much. This should be a visceral response. I'm going to show you the picture of someone's work, and I want you to give me just the first word, the first instinct, the first reaction that you have to this picture when you see it, this image when you see it. All right, here comes the picture. Get your chat ready. First word, if you spend more than 3 to 5 seconds thinking about it, you're way overthinking it. Your visceral reaction to this person's work. So just drop those into the chat. What's our predominant words that we're seeing
It
here?
looks like lazy, incompetent, sloppy, seeing that over and over again.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, for when we do this exercise, a lot of the responses that we get are just that. It's lazy or sloppy, doesn't care. Um, and so let me tell you a little bit about that image, though. So that image, and your response to it is kind of what we talked about last time, is that operational friction in action. Um, Now imagine I told you that prior to that incident, John, who is the guy who painted that line, was considered a high performer. That morning, his boss came to him and said, "Hey, I need you to hit your mileage quota. We haven't been hitting the mileage quotas. I need you to hit your mileage quota." So he gave him an ultimatum: hit your mileage quota, or you might be looking for a new job. And so John goes back to Mike and says, "Well, Mike, don't I do a good job?" He says, "You do a great job." He's like, you're the most conscientious. You have the straightest lines in the whole fleet, but we need to hit our mileage quotas. I'm getting a lot of pressure from corporate, and they're insisting that you get your mileage quota." And he pleads with him again. He says, "Well, listen, the crew that's supposed to go out ahead of me hasn't been doing a really good job, and so I have to stop the rig so that I can clear the road, so I can keep my straight lines." And he goes, "Listen, they're just going to look at that as excuses. I need you to get your mileage quota." So now with that context in mind, you might see that white line a little differently. But also, as John's story kind of demonstrates, to understand why this happened and fix it, it's really not enough to just look at how the line was painted or how John was trained or how he should even be disciplined for doing that workaround. You have to look at the cultural conditions that led to its painting and what interpersonal competencies or lack of impacted how this work gets done. And so this is where I think, and we kind of touched on this last time, but this is where I think it's important to remember that culture isn't something separate from these everyday moments. It's being created in these moments. How people respond to each other, what gets reinforced, what gets ignored, what people learn is safe or risky. All of that starts to shape how work gets done. And the more those patterns repeat, the more they begin to feel normal. It was normal for me to, sit in my car for 2 hours at the end of the day because I was not going to go back in and turn that book in and get the next book to continue reading meters. So the culture people experience is really the accumulation of these kinds of choices and interactions. And at the same time, that culture starts influencing the choices people make next. And so what I want to do again, and if you get your chat ready, with that in mind, I'm going to show you another picture, and I want you to drop in into the chat the first word that comes to mind again when you see this picture. So what's the first word that comes to mind now when you see this picture? So I'm noticing some different responses now, which is interesting because the line hasn't changed. John hasn't changed. But what changed is the problem you think you're looking at now, right? A moment ago, the problem might have appeared to be effort or attitude or discipline, or maybe even someone's personality. Because if we say that someone is lazy, well, then we're making a character judgment about who that person is. But with a little bit more context, we're open to considering that what we're looking at may be an expectation problem or maybe a leadership response problem, or as I'm looking through some of the responses here, maybe a conflict problem or a measurement problem or working environment that has encouraged exactly that behavior that we're actually criticizing. The way we define the problem determines what we try to fix. And so if we define this as a lazy problem, well, how do you fix a lazy problem? Well, you fired John and you get somebody who's not lazy, right? But if our perspective is incomplete, we can solve the wrong problem, but very efficiently. And so we could have solved this problem very efficiently, but would we have actually solved the problem?
Scott, what I'm noticing is that in the first reaction, it was giving an attribute to a person, lazy, as an
Yeah.
example. In the second conversations, we're now talking a little bit more about what the experience was, or what the context is, or what the environment is.
Mhm.
It's a really interesting shift simply by knowing the background.
Yeah. Yeah. And I have a minute here. I'm just looking at the time. I've got I think I'm maybe a minute or two ahead. So maybe open up the conversation. If there's any reaction someone has, if you want to just come on mute, what is your reaction to this in this moment? Or any thought that you might be having about this?
I think this is the great equalizer to don't get your exercise by jumping to conclusions. Look for the context and the rest of the story that goes in
Exactly.
behind it.
Yeah. And I think what's interesting about this is that how many times do we show up at work and we see this line? We come to work every day and we see the white line every day. And how often we're like, oh, it's because those guys don't care. Well, that department, they do the minimum that they have to do. We jump to these conclusions. We jump these bridges that are maybe the wrong bridges to jump. And we do that all the time. And that was one of the big realizations that we had as we were kind of designing this program is oh, how often do we do that? And the more often we do that, the more often we're probably starting to solve the wrong problem. And so with that, the last session we talked about this chart. We talked about how improvement is a choice, and both that choice and the response to it impacts the quality of the execution and maybe the contribution of those who are involved. If we look at John's experience through this lens, John's experience illustrates this very well, right? And we can see it more clearly. He tried to raise a concern, but got shut down. So he raised this concern, and so he got shut down. So what did he do? When faced with that challenge and circumstance, he felt he had to work around it. Though he had asked for help to be able to move quickly, what happened? His supervisor, said, "Hey, you can't do that. Just get your job done." So he was instructed that the status quo was more valuable. And so, though his inclination was to go out of his way to solve the problem at the source, he was told to stick with the familiar solution. So even though he tried to contribute, the response to his intention was kind of thwarted. So he was trying to contribute there. His participation was reduced to compliance, and to the casual observer, that appeared as if he, was checked out, or he was lazy, or that he wasn't doing his job right. Here's the reality, though. It was that the system he was working in valued compliance more than contribution, speed over quality, and that is exactly the result that we got. If I go back to Deming, the system is perfectly designed to get the results that it gets. And so, this kind of friction not only creates these inefficiencies and waste that hit the bottom line, it also creates the conditions for disengagement, which generates even more inefficiency and waste. Unily reports that it's like 1 in 5 frontline workers loses more than an hour every shift to communication and coordination failures. It's just amazing. And Gallup estimates that a disengaged employee, and I'm sure a lot of you have seen these Gallup surveys, but that a disengaged employee can cost an organization about 34% of their annual salary in lost output and reduced productivity. So, when we talk about interpersonal friction, we're not talking about something that sits on the side of the business that is this ancillary thing. It shows up in time, it shows up in productivity, it shows up in coordination, it shows up in the way people engage. Ultimately, it shows up in the performance of that organization or that team or that work group. And that scale, we're not talking about a few people who need to have some better interpersonal skills. We're talking about, organizationally as a whole. So again, we're talking about patterns of behavior that affect how work gets done across the organization. And those patterns are systematic. Changing them means changing how they're created, how they're maybe even reinforced in the everyday interactions where culture is continually shaping at that point of execution. It was an accident that we were talking about the meter reading, but how much inefficiency is intentionally created because of the conditions around that person. So having been through hundreds of experiences like the white line, the question I started to ask myself was, what had to be true in those interactions for people like John, like his boss's boss, and everyone around them to consistently make the choices continuous improvement depends on?
You have to come close to me. I can't hear you.
And so I kept asking that. And so working backwards from the outcomes organizations pursue, when we're pursuing continuous improvement or OpEx, and what we're trying to achieve there, the competencies and conditions that enable them, as well as the sequence in which they were experienced, became pretty apparent. So I started to see this pattern. And so, I started to think about, and I started to look at alignment, because alignment is what turns individual effort into organizational performance. So, we when people are not aligned, the organization pays for it in a lot of hidden ways. Meetings multiply, decisions slow down, priorities start to compete with each other, frustration starts to build between people. People may be working hard, but their strategy gets trapped in that clarification, into that white line rework, in conflict, in maybe some of these competing assumptions. So most leaders try to solve this with maybe better strategies or clearer goals, or some communication skills that we're going to try to add to this. Those things matter, and they are important, but they're usually not enough. Getting on the same page is not just an information problem, it's an engagement and an execution problem. And so if we want people to get on the same page, they need to be in real dialogue with each other. That means people must feel safe and capable enough to speak with candor, so that the real issue, that those challenges, those tensions, and those conflicts can actually get on the table. And so, but candor doesn't appear out of nowhere. It doesn't just materialize because we say, hey, we've got to be candid. People are more willing to speak with candor when they have learned and when they have the skills to show their cards. They're more willing to be transparent about their intentions, about their goals, about maybe even the things that they're challenged by, maybe even the things that they're not great at and that they need help with, their concerns. And when those concerns, and when they can trust that honesty will be used, it won't be used against them. When, if I tell you something, you're not going to then use that against me later. That trust helps us speak with candor. It helps us get on the same page. But also what we discovered was that trust grows when people feel seen, when people are appreciated, when they're recognized for their contributions, when people are what we call spotlighted for their positive impact that they're making. They're more likely to believe their voice matters, and they're more willing to then step up. We've talked lots about people should be recognized and appreciated, but is that being done systematically? We're more willing to spotlight others when we value others and their individuality, when we recognize that every person brings something unique to the table. We become more attentive to the individual contributions, their perspective, their strengths, their experiences that might, otherwise go unnoticed or underappreciated. And we are more able to value individuality when we care about well-being, not just our own, but each other's. When we understand that people are not separate from their stress, from their energy, from the pressure, from the challenges, from those circumstances that we're experiencing, we begin to see the full person, not just maybe the role that they're in. And so, we prioritize well-being because we have learned how to act to support one another, not just fixing people, not to take over what they're doing or to just push them aside and get it done, but to offer support in a way that serves their best interest and really to help them move forward. And we're willing to support each other because we have taken the time to seek to understand. We've listened long enough to learn about each other's challenges, what each other's needs are, maybe what those pressures are, their perspective. Really, what are the challenges that someone is facing? And we can only truly seek to understand when we're willing to check our perspective. When we suspend our assumptions and our judgments, when we create the space to hear what people are actually saying, instead of reacting to the story that we've already written in our heads about the white line, about John, about who he is and what his intentions were. And so this is why alignment is not simply a meeting outcome or a communication tactic. It's really the result of a behavioral infrastructure. And that's kind of what I was just walking you through, that behavioral infrastructure. And so engage with compassion comes first because it develops our ability to see the people and the problem more objectively, to get kind of beyond the initial assumptions, to understand more of what is actually happening, and then be able to respond accordingly. Treating people like they matter builds from there by expanding whose experience and perspectives and contributions we recognize, and how do we draw on that experience and those contributions. And then partner for mutual benefit then develops our ability to leverage that collective contribution to better execute and innovate. And so there's an infrastructure here. And so though the conditions we ultimately want to influence are collective, every one of us experiences and contributes to those conditions kind of from our individual perspective. So what we design, so the roadmap starts with the part of the system each person can see and change, and that's their own contribution to it. Then the lens widens. What does my behavior make possible or more difficult for someone else? And then it widens even a little bit further. And then what do interactions like this repeated across people and over time create collectively? That is the self to system logic of the roadmap of how we've designed this system. That awareness from self to the relational to the systematic dimensions is the through line which each principle across the roadmap and as a whole has been designed around. And so, which brings us to kind of this first principle and the first set of behaviors of the roadmap. So engage with compassion. And this first one, check your perspective, which we've now demonstrated, we all have a tendency, and it's a natural, it's a human kind of inclination to judge. That is something that, it's just the way we are biologically designed. And so there's no judgment in that, but it does require us to develop some skills so that we can move beyond that initial assumption or that initial judgment that we're going to make. So if the learning begins with self, then the first thing we have to become better at is seeing seeing is what tendencies, what assumptions, what judgments, and what interpretation of what is actually happening. Are we seeing the white line and then interpreting it as lazy, or are we seeing it and then using these new skills that we're learning to do something about that? So engage with compassion is just kind of a reminder to look beyond these surface appearances or what seem like these obvious behaviors, to consider more the context of people's actions, to consider, what is really going on around John. The goal is to shift from being reactive to being a little bit more reflective in our problem solving. So in this first piece, in this first principle, we've got three behaviors. So the first one is check your perspective, and that helps us recognize the assumptions and the judgments that are shaping our first interpretations of the white line. The next one is to seek to understand, and that broadens our awareness by learning to ask for context, to maybe get more information, to go to the Gemba, to get that firsthand experience, and to get that perspective that we maybe don't have yet. What's really going on around? Instead of saying, oh, yes, lazy, saying, oh, that's interesting. I wonder what's going on around that. I wonder what the unmet need was that caused that to happen. And then the third behavior is active support, and that moves us from understanding to maybe constructive action. And the important thing about active support is that, we're supporting people not to take over, but to say, how can I support you in your best interest? And so that's an important part of that third behavior, active support. And so those are the things that we're learning and teaching and learning in this first principle.
And it strikes me, Scott, as you're talking, that it's not just about cerebral understanding of those three. It's about how do we then incorporate that into our work when things are sticky, when things are stressful, at times where we might not have that at front of mind, getting those habits installed.
Absolutely. And especially when we're under stress, because when we're under stress, we're going to default to that reactionary mode. And so having that skill set more easily available, having tools, having methods that collectively we've agreed on that we can tap into, especially when it's stressful, allow us to make sure that we don't jump to those conclusions, that we don't make those judgments, that we actually practice these three things so that we can get to better problem solving. So, absolutely. All right. So a lot of people wonder how an operations consultant got to engage with compassion, in my pursuit of really of continuous improvement. And, why do we not call it engage with objectivity or something like that? Well, first, objectivity is necessary, but it's not really sufficient. Improvement isn't only about seeing a situation more accurately. It's about what we do with what we see, and then how we engage the people involved as we work to make whatever that situation is better. The second thing I will tell you is that improvement asks a lot of people. If you've been at this game for a little while, you know that it asks people to surface problems, it asks them to challenge assumptions, it asks them to admit mistakes, maybe even receive some feedback and some correction. We're asking people to experiment. We're asking people to be okay with failure. We're asking people to sometimes change their minds. We're asking people to try again. Hey, that didn't work, so let's do something again. How compassionately people are treated in those moments shapes their willingness to contribute and then to try again to do the next thing. So that's the second thing. The third thing is there's a strong parallel between Kaizen and engage with compassion. I could do a whole talk about just Kaizen, but Kaizen asks us to move beyond our first explanation of a problem, to understand the actual condition of what's going on, what we're looking at, and then act to improve it. Engage with compassion is how we move through that progression of awareness from a relational standpoint, that we're checking our perspective, that we're seeking to understand, and then we're acting to support whoever those stakeholders are in their best interest, not necessarily mine, but in their best interest. And so that's why we call it engage with compassion, because it's not enough to just have empathy. It's not enough to just see it. There's an active act component that has to come in. And that's the difference between empathy and compassion, is that there's an action component to it. So anyway, so that's the engage with compassion component of this. Melinda, I think I was going to bring you in here if you want to share a little bit. I think you're on mute, Melinda.
Sorry about that. Yeah, we've been looking at the engaging through compassion with this lens of continuous improvement and operational excellence. And that same capability, however, it's being increasingly valuable beyond improvement work. What we found is as organizations change faster, they become more complex and increasingly shaped by technology. This ability to interpret the context, question our assumptions, bring different perspectives into the picture, adjust as conditions change and become more consequential. That's where engaging with compassion starts to strengthen our ability to discern. And it strengthens the discernment of organizations that will increasingly rely on to navigate change, make use of what people across the system know. What we found, and Scott, you're right on spot here, that the more that we're able to do this, suspending our judgment, understanding where people come from, understanding the context, we're moving beyond just the tools and using those as a springboard then for improving our culture and getting better results. That we have to behave differently, and that this helps us to do that.
And I will say, I know your conference is coming up around AI and people, and in this age of bringing AI into our work, this particular principle is becoming so much more relevant, so much more important, and so much more necessary, because as AI is taking on more of the load of the technical aspects, the relational aspects are becoming that much more critical, that we do those better and we do those more right. So this is becoming even that much more important.
Well, we're even stepping away from those, that engagement, that interpersonal reaction as part of our daily work. More and more of it is conversing with the AI chat or with some sort of agentic AI help. But how do we get work done with people? I mean, it's still so critical, even more so, as you said.
And I think we have a couple of minutes here if we wanted to maybe field a question or two before we kind of move them on to what's going to happen next.
I think that'd be great. So everyone, feel free to take yourself off mute or ask a question in chat. Love to hear from you. Hunter, I like how the word compass is contained within compassion. Nice observation.
I have a question.
Yeah,
Please.
go for it, Gwendolyn.
Thank you. So I was a few minutes late, so I may have missed it. But what I'm not getting, what you're saying is completely resonant. It feels true, genuine, compassionate, complete. What is the translation process to get these ideas and these models into practice? Would you summarize that or give us a look?
Do you want to take that, Melinda, or you want me to take it?
Go ahead, Scott.
Okay. So what we're walking you through right now is kind of the way that we take a team or an
Is
organization
this profile picture
through
found
this
anywhere else
process.
online?
And so if I back up here, let me back up to this slide here. So there is a process that we take people through. So the first thing that we take people through is this engage with compassion. And it is learning the tools and the skill sets to check your perspective, to then learn the tools and skill sets to seek to understand, and then learning the tools and behaviors to act to support. That kind of sets the foundation for this system that we're building. We know that we're working towards trying to get everybody on the same page so that we can have better engagement and better execution. That's kind of the ultimate goal. When we backed into this, we realized, oh, we can't just say, hey, have a meeting and get on the same page, because we did that. We saw people try to do that, and they did a terrible job at it because they were judging each other. They weren't caring about each other. They weren't being transparent with each other. They really weren't saying what needed to be said. So as we backed into, okay, well, what needs to be true in order to get on the same page? And that's kind of why I backed you through this model. To get on the same page, you really need to be able to be candid. You need to be more transparent. You can't do that if we don't appreciate each other and we don't value each other and we're not thinking about each other's well-being in the context of that work. And we won't do that if we're not trying to actively support each other. And we won't support each other if we don't understand the problem that you're facing. And I can't understand the problem if I'm judging you. If I say you're lazy, I'm not going to try to figure out why you painted that line the way you did. And so there's a system that we take people through, and that's kind of what we're walking you through. So this time we took you through the engage with compassion piece. Next time we'll take you through treat people like they matter, and then we'll take you through partner for mutual benefit and how all of this kind of connects to each other. Is that helpful?
It's a beginning.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Anastasia says, I am interested in your opinion about recognition, quote, I am against recognizing people doing things that are a part of their work, as many companies do.
You know, do you ever recognize your kids for, hey, I appreciate you emptying the dishwasher? I mean, yes, that's part of their chores. They're supposed to do it. But if you want to encourage that behavior, recognizing it is a simple, easy step to do that. It's like, should I not appreciate somebody for doing their job? I know I feel appreciated when someone says, hey, you did it. My job is here to present this material. I do appreciate when Melinda says, hey, Scott, I think you did a great job. Okay, that's my job. I still appreciate it when people notice it, when I feel valued. The more valued and appreciated I feel, the more likely I am to step into that work. Even though I'm obligated to do it, the more valued and appreciated I feel, the more I'm likely to step into it and maybe even step it up. And so, I get, hey, this is what you're paid for. So you don't get a biscuit because, you did your job. But I can tell you that if you look at the psychology of this work, people are going to step into their work more when they feel valued, listened to, and appreciated.
And I would also offer, Scott, and you'll probably get into this next time, that the spotlighting others is not just about a superficial recognition. It's about understanding what that unique person brings to that unique situation, which is something that perhaps no one else would have that ability to do. And that feels different. And you're right. The comment back was, oh, we're not talking about formal recognition. You're absolutely right. This is about interaction, person to person.
Yeah, and we'll get into this next time. So I don't want to give it away right now, but when people see Spotlight Others, there's two things. They're like, oh, they think of only the results, that we're only recognizing the results, and that's a piece of it. That's not the whole story. And second, that, oh, we're gonna, make this big spectacle. It could be a simple one-on-one thank you. It could be a note that you leave for somebody. It's not that you're making a spectacle. It is that you are connecting with that individual and just letting them feel seen, heard, and valued.
Thanks, Scott. Diane says, I like the idea of shifting from reactive to reflective. Taking a pause and considering the context seems important.
Mhm.
Yeah, I had the same reaction when I first heard about these kind of those words and connecting those, that there's quite a difference between reacting and reflecting. The speed, the way that you respond. So thank you, Scott, for sharing that with all of us.
Yeah.
I'm looking to see if there's any more questions. Wonderful comments. Thanks, everybody, for those. Question. Thanks, Hunter. Do you think the environment for the system can impact the success of this methodology? For example, a football team setting.
Yeah. I haven't done this with a football team, but I can tell you that I've done it with such a variety of different kinds of groups of people and work environments that um, that I don't think that the kind of business or the kind of makeup of that collection of people matters. That all of these principles apply, um, whether it's in a work setting or whether it's on a football team. Um, but I do think that if you are practicing these 9 things that we're going to share with you over the next couple of weeks, wherever you are, it is going to have a profound impact. I can tell you that people who go through this process, go through this journey, more often than not, the comments that we get back are about their personal lives, less than their work lives. We get so many comments about how this work and these reflections and these mindset shifts and some of these tools and behaviors that they're shifting to have affected them in a very personal way, and have affected their personal lives and their home lives. So I think it can affect many different environments.
Well, thanks, Scott. And we are at the end of our session. I'm going to just say that we hope that you will join us on September 8th. We're going to explore that second principle of the roadmap, which is treat people like they matter, and how this practice of this principle helps organizations broaden who contributes to the improvement. So we're all looking forward to that. I just put this link into chat also. For next time, we're going to invite you to participate in an additional session assessment. If you've been following along, you know that each of these sessions builds on the last by helping us to understand how the respect for people creates these conditions where continuous improvement can thrive. So before the first session, we invited you to complete the organizational friction assessment. And that started to answer the question, well, what organizational patterns may be slowing our execution? And then before today's session, we invited you to complete the personal assessment. And that started to answer the question, well, how do I naturally tend to show up? And perhaps you were thinking about that as you listened to our content today. Before our next session, we'd like to invite you to complete this prioritized well-being assessment. And this assessment asks, well, what are the conditions and what conditions influence my capacity to show up the way that I want to. So we hope that you get some good insight from that content that will help you think about our next session. Just a reminder that all of the information about the Respect for People Roadmap, if you'd like to learn more, you can link to our website. You'll see testimonials there, a little bit more about the full roadmap program. And certainly, if you can, we would love to see you at our conference, our 22nd annual conference, People in AI, the Future of Continuous Improvement, is being held in Springfield, Mass, September 29th and 30th. Scott and Dan will be there, as well as many of our partners, to explore this interesting topic. So with that, thank you so much for being here today. We'll see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you, Scott and Melinda.
Thank you.